Please forgive me if I come across as a little bit nervous. I'm not a little bit nervous. I'm a lot nervous. Because this is my first... I did give a sermon before at my old church back home. I was given 3 minutes to preach it. This is going to be my first full-length sermon. The first sermon I did, I started with a joke that fell completely flat. It ended up okay, but it was an experience. Today I've decided to... first of all, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Richard McKibben. For those who don't know me, or who've just seen me about, I'm not a Texan, as I've alluded to earlier. I'm from Northern Ireland. I'm from a little place called Cumber in Northern Ireland. I have lived in Savoy for 5 years. I'm married to Melody. And I also live with a Russian blue cat who actually runs our household, called Zena. But with that, I have decided to preach on perhaps one of the most multifaceted and most fascinating portions of Scripture in the whole of the Gospel of John. I have decided to preach on one of my favourite Bible stories from the Gospels, and that is John chapter 4. And that's when Jesus is walking through Samaria. He stops at a well and meets a woman of a bad reputation. So I'm going to start at John chapter 4, and I'm going to start at verse 4. Now Jesus had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar. Near the plot of ground, Jacob had given his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired from his journey, sat down by the well, and it was by now about the 6th hour. Sorry. In my research over the last few weeks, I've did some research into who the Samaritans were and the Samaritans' relationship with the Jews. At this time, Jesus was going from the south, from Jerusalem north, to his homeland in Judea, probably around Capernaum, is what scholars think at this time. And so, while it was quicker generally to go through Samaria, a lot of Jews avoided the area completely. A lot of devout Jews, and Jesus was a devout Jew, absolutely would go hundreds of miles out of the way to avoid Samaria. And there's a reason for this. In the short passage I read, this Sychar village has a lot of Jewish cred. It's the place where Jacob gave some ground to Joseph. It's a very Jewish place in some ways. Not only that, Sychar had a few names before that. Shechem, Shiloh. This was a place where the Ark of the Covenant was before it was taken to Jerusalem. And that's part of the problem. You see, when the Ark of the Covenant and the temple was moved to Jerusalem, the people in Samaria kind of got jealous. They felt that it should have stayed in, I believe the name of the mountain is Mount Gerizim. And to this day, the small Samaritan community in Israel have sacrifices on this mountain. It's where the Ark of the Covenant, it's where the tabernacle was for the first years after the existence of Israel. Later on, and 2 Kings chapter 7 talks about this, during the I think it's the Assyrian invasion. The Assyrians colonized the area, and the Samaritans intermarried with a lot of these Assyrians, and a lot of the Assyrian religion got mixed into the Samaritan religion, as Samaritans only recognized the first 5 books of the Bible. They didn't recognize the Psalms or the prophets or a lot of the history books. So there's a lot here. Just the fact, so the Samaritans and the Jews kind of resented each other. But it also says another thing that is really, really interesting. Jesus, tired from his journey, sat at the well. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is God. Yet in his human body, he was tired. You know, a lot of people think God is very distant from us. But when I look at Jesus, when I read in Philippians that Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, yet he was tired from his journey. A lot of people think Jesus doesn't know what we go through down here. Absolutely, God knows what we go through, because God in Jesus was here in human flesh, and he was tired. He was tired at the well. And also it tells us what time of the day it is. It's about the 6th hour. This is going to be very important. Now the 6th hour is around 12 p.m. It's noon, the hottest part of the day. And what I'm going to speak to you about in the next portion is why that is important. Then a Samaritan woman came to draw water. And Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. So this Samaritan woman came at 12 in the afternoon, and she was alone. In that society, women came to the well in groups, and they did it much earlier in the day, because it's arduous work carrying these massive earthen jugs of water back and forth. Yet here's this woman at the middle of the day, at the hottest part of the day, coming to the well to draw water with her massive earthen jugs. This tells us something. This tells us that this woman is an outcast. She is an outcast in an outcast community. She is the outcast of the outcasts. She is the outcast of the outcasts. And yet Jesus, a devout Jew, asks her for a drink. There is like 5 social conventions of that time that Jesus broke here. She is a Samaritan. She is a woman. We find out later that she has had 5 husbands, and that the one she is living with at the moment is not her husband. Jesus shouldn't be anywhere near this place, and he should not be talking to this woman. But he does. He does. And it gives us an example of how outreach should be done. We should go to the outcast of the outcasts, the lowest of the low. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You're a Jew, I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews did not associate with the Samaritans. I've already pointed that bit out. Jews did not associate with Samaritans. I grew up in a divided society. I grew up in Northern Ireland. We had a pretty bad for about 40 years. It's still going on in some ways. And when I was at university in Belfast, I would take public transport because I can't drive into downtown Belfast, and I would maybe do some shopping, and then if I had a lecture I would take the train to where my university was, north of Belfast, because it was easier to take the train. The problem was that the railroad station the main railroad station in Belfast, which is called Belfast Central, even though it's not very central, only in Ireland. Between downtown Belfast and this railroad station is an area called the Markets. This was a Catholic area. I'm a Protestant. And I would avoid going past this Markets area if I was walking to the railroad station. I would go through another area called Lanyon Place. It would be a neutral area. It was kind of businessy. There was concert halls and stuff there. It would take me about half a mile out of my way, so it wouldn't be as extreme as the way the Jews would have avoided Samaria, but I would have still avoided the area. I didn't want to get attacked. People from my background could get attacked in that area. Now, I must say, anytime I did actually walk past that area, no one bothered me at all, but it was still something that was in my mind. And that's kind of how the Jews thought of Samaria. They thought of it as a place that you shouldn't be in. And the fact that Jesus, again, talked to this lady, not only talked to her, but asked for something. He asked for something. And this shocked the Samaritan woman, because, as I say, this is like 4 social conventions in one that Jesus has broken here. And Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God, you would, and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked me to have given you living water. I've never really understood this, so I read some commentaries on. I've always wondered if this woman died of dehydration. But actually, Jesus has an interesting play of words here, because living water was actually a spring. It's an actual thing. It's a spring. And as we found out later in the chapter, the Samaritan woman's actually taking Jesus literally at first here. And we'll see that in a moment. Sir, the woman said, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can I go and get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as also did his sons and his flocks and his herds? So this Samaritan woman is kind of being, I think, a little sarcastic. Are you greater than this Jacob, this Jew of Jews, who gave us this land, who dug this well himself, who drank from it? Do you know somewhere that Jacob didn't know about? I'd love to go to this place so that I don't have to come here at this time of the day and face the scorn of my people. So she's taking it literally. She wants this water. She's thinking of her practical need. And Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty. But whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become unto him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. The woman said to him, Sir, give me this water so that I won't go thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water. So, yet again, this woman's not getting the metaphor. She isn't getting the metaphor because she's still thinking of her practical need. The need to get water at an earlier time of the day. And better quality water possibly as well. And Jesus answered, this is where the passage gets really, really interesting. And this is actually where Jesus tries to correct one of the social social norms here. He told her, go call your husband and come back. I have no husband, she replies. And Jesus said to her, you're right to say you have no husband. In fact, you've had 5 husbands. And the man you now have is not your husband. What you said is quite true. So Jesus is actually using a social convention here. In that culture, men and women didn't talk openly to each other, and if in a situation like this, a man wanted to talk to a woman, he would ask the woman to call her husband. This is a completely social norm. But Jesus uses it in a different way. He uses it to reveal something about the woman. He uses it to reveal the situation she is living in. And Jesus didn't speak words here of condemnation. We find later that's not what happened. Jesus never actually condemns this woman. But I believe in this statement, Jesus convicts her. And I think that's the way Jesus communicates with a lot of Christians and a lot of people who aren't believers either. Jesus doesn't speak condemnation, he speaks conviction. He wants people to change. It says it is not the Father's will that any should perish. So Jesus speaks conviction. He does not speak condemnation. Not to those who are seeking him. And I believe, and we see later on, that this woman is seeking the truth. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. Sir, the woman said, I can see you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place that you must worship is Jerusalem. So this woman can see that there's something special about this man. This weird, devout Jew who shouldn't be in Sychar, who shouldn't be in Samaria at all, and definitely shouldn't be talking to her. So, it's interesting. I find it interesting. A lot of people who you would think don't really know all that much about God or Jesus know quite a bit, especially in the South or Northern Ireland, places that have a bit more of a religious ethos, let's say. They know things, they know enough to ask interesting questions. And this is exactly what this woman does. And I think she's possibly trying to deflect a bit of the conviction here too. And this is again going back into Jewish history. I think she probably pointed to Mount Gerizim and say, our fathers worship here, you think Jerusalem's the place. This is the great divide between Jews and the Samaritans. This is the theological divide here. This is the crux of the matter. And Jesus' reply, Jesus declared, to believe me, woman, the time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For they are the kind of worshippers the Father seek. God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in spirit and truth. This is an awesome passage. This is an awesome passage because for me, this is actually not something that is prescriptive, actually. It is descriptive. It is looking to a time when the sacrificial system of the Jews will be fulfilled. It's actually a prophecy about Jesus' own sacrifice in some ways. That the sacrificial system will be fulfilled, that it will be obsolete. Not that it was wrong necessarily, and Jesus kind of corrects the woman about the Jewish way, but it's almost a prophecy about what we're doing here today. Jesus has broken down the barrier between Jew and Samaritan and Gentile. Jesus unites those who believe him, whether they be a guy from Northern Ireland who 6 years ago Savoy was a cabbage. I thought you'd get that. Or whether it be Samaritans. And in fact, in Acts, after the persecution, after Stephen, the church in Samaria grew by leaps and bounds. So, and it was because of the people were scattered all through Judea and Samaria. The Bible talks about that, I believe, in Luke or in Acts 8. But anyway, I digress. But what we're talking about here is authenticity. We recognize the spiritual nature of God. It's not just some cold religion. And it's not something where there's just these, you must follow this rule, this rule, this rule, this rule, wear this thing, this thing, this thing, this thing. It's deeper than that. It's deeper than just how we worship. In fact, I don't even think it's really what we're doing now. I really don't. I think it's what we do in our homes, our workplaces, our everyday life, a 24/7 thing. And this is where the rubber meets the road. The woman said, I know the Messiah, called the Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. This is probably one of the most overlooked verses, yet probably the most important verse, probably the second most important verse in this whole chapter. Because this woman, for all that was wrong, had her hope in the Messiah. Her hope was in Jesus. She didn't know her hope was in Jesus, but that's where her hope was. She had hope in the Messiah. For all that was wrong, married 5 times, living with a guy she wasn't married to, Samaritan woman, yet her hope was in the Messiah. That is the important thing to realize here. If nothing else, keep your hope on Jesus. Keep your hope on Jesus. And then Jesus, this is the most important verse in this chapter. Jesus declared, I who speak to you am he. At this point, he didn't even tell his disciples he was Messiah, yet he tells this woman. Isn't that interesting? The disciples found out for themselves, but he tells this woman straight that he's the Messiah. That's mind-blowing. This perfect stranger. And he tells her that the Messiah has come, and in fact that she is speaking to him face to face. I wonder what her face looked like. I wonder what her face looked like. And then it gets really interesting here. In my past few weeks when I've been studying this chapter, my mind's been blown again and again and again. There's so much in it. I was wanting to actually stop here, but the more I read, the more I said, oh, that's really important, that's really important, that's really important. So forgive me if I go long. I'm really enjoying this, by the way. Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked, what do you want? Or why are you talking to her? Then, leaving her water jars, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, come see the man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Christ? And they came out of town and made their way towards him. I told you it got very interesting here. I'm convinced that the disciples were probably in a state of shock and horror most of the time they were with Jesus, because they just saw him break social convention after social convention. Yet they probably knew they were going to get told off if they asked him. There was probably some great spiritual lesson, so they didn't ask him what they were doing. And then, leaving her jar behind, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, come see the man who told me everything I'd ever done. Could this be the Christ? They came and made their way to the town towards him. Whoa. That's all I can say is this. This woman who has a bad reputation, leaves her water jobs, leaves things that would have, she is so determined to get back to Sychar to tell her community about Jesus that she leaves her jugs behind. She leaves the things that would hold her back, and she knew she was coming back anyway, probably, and she leaves them behind so she could get to Sychar as quickly as possible and tell people. I'm not sure there's people out in the streets. I always imagine it to be like Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. The English are coming, the English coming. The Messiah's here, the Messiah's here, the Messiah is here. And he told me everything I ever did. And this is, again, where I think Jesus speaks conviction rather than condemnation. This woman was under conviction because Jesus revealed her sin to her. And that made her recognize the Messiah. That's really interesting. And they came. I'm astonished they came, but they came. And and it's really, really awesome, because this woman who had a bad reputation, her past and even her present were forgotten because Jesus, the Messiah, was there. Amen. And she put her trust in the Messiah. Meanwhile, his disciples urged him, "Rabbi, eat something." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you know nothing about." Then his disciples said to each other, "Could someone have brought him food?" "My food," said Jesus, "is to do the will of him who sent me to finish the work. Do you say 4 months more, then the harvest? I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe for harvest." So we're coming here to a point where Jesus knows what's about to happen. But I think a more interesting point, that Jesus, the very reason for Jesus' being in Sychar is to fulfill the will of the Father. This conversation, all of it, is the will of the Father. It shows Jesus' complete and utter submission to the will of the Father. And it's shown even more in the Garden of Gethsemane and on Calvary. But even now, it shows Christ's submission to the will of the Father. That he even finds sustenance, it seems, in doing the will of the Father. And it's amazing to me that I said before the human side of Jesus. And it's amazing that Jesus would take on human flesh to suffer and die for me. It says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And it's amazing to me that Jesus would come to seek and save those who are lost. But that's exactly, literally what he did here, and what he's did for every one of us here today. Anyway, I digress. Harvest. Even now the reaper draws his wages. Even now the harvest crops for eternal life, so that the sower and the reaper may be glad together. Thus the saying, one sows and another reaps, is true. I sent you to reap what you have not worked. Others have done the hard work, and you have reaped the benefits of their labour. I think this is interesting in the way that about witnessing. And I look back at people who have witnessed to me where I didn't respond immediately, but what they've told me has stayed with me. And I think it's I remember a gentleman by the name of Mark Robinson. I was in an organisation called the Apprentice Boys of Derry, and he gave me a ride out to a meeting one night. He's a Christian, and we were waiting outside the place where we were meeting, and he told me about the gospel. And there's other people too, probably hundreds. But although I didn't respond right then, I did respond eventually. So even if you're witnessing to someone and they don't respond eventually, doesn't mean they'll never respond. So, keep at it. Keep at it. And I'm about to draw my sermon to a close in this last part. Many Samaritans from that town believed in him, and because of the woman's testimony, he told me everything I ever did. So the Samaritans came to him and urged him to stay with them 2 days. And he stayed with them 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. They said to the woman, "We no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Saviour of the world." It's amazing to me, there's no recorded miracles of this 2-day trip to Samaria. There's nothing recorded about miraculous signs, healings, or anything like that. The only divine thing we see is what he said to the woman. The Jews were always asking for miracles. They were always asking for signs. Yet in Samaria, where, you would think Jesus would be rejected, there was no miracles. Not that's recorded anyway. It's interesting to me, a lot of people put a lot of stock in signs and wonders. And I'm not discounting signs and wonders, but there's so many people whose faith is divined by these signs and wonders. They believe that you have to have a certain sign and wonder gift to be saved. They believe in... and I wonder, is that really what it's all about? Signs and wonders? Does Jesus really have to prove himself with signs and wonders? He didn't have to do it here in Samaria, the place who should have rejected him. Yet many Christians today rely on these signs and wonders to believe in Jesus. I find that interesting. But anyway, that's my sermon to a close, really. A few final thoughts. All I can say is this has been a very interesting sermon for me to preach. I hope it's been as interesting for you to listen to it as it has been for me to study it and then to preach it. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. But sometimes, and I'll put a caveat in this, that I'm speaking probably 10 times as much to myself as I am to you. Sometimes it's probably a good idea to get out of your comfort zone. I am an introvert. I am the introvert of introverts. So this is difficult for me. Going out, reaching people is difficult for me. But the imperative is there. People need Jesus. People need Jesus. And they need to hear authenticity. They don't need these pious words of, "Oh, I'm so great, I'm so perfect." But they don't need to hear condemnation. But they do need to hear conviction. Speak conviction, not condemnation. Also, don't be surprised at who you're surprised that gets saved. Don't be surprised if the worst reprobate ever gets saved. Because that's all. Because people, these Samaritans, according to, shouldn't have got saved. Not in the natural world anyway. Not in the how it should have been. But the gospel is different. The gospel is life-changing. The gospel has power to save people who we think are beyond our reach. And that's all I have today. I'd like to ask Brian Neal to close us out in prayer.